I think, again, it's undoubtedly the case that Brexit has profoundly damaged community relations. You know, most of us, I believe, you know, work or live in London. We live in communities that are really at the cold face. They're the communities that are going to be most damaged by the pernicious politics of Brexit. How has it been damaged? Well, it's been damaged because there's been a legitimation of othering, a defining those who belong and those who don't belong, who has the right to be here as a citizen and those who should either have some kind of half measure of citizenship or indeed just should go. Are we more divided as a consequence of Brexit? And I think that is a serious question to ask. I think the divisions are more a consequence of a decade of austerity, more than a decade of austerity. There's the widening gap between rich and poor, reflected in health statistics, in life expectancy, in all sorts of measures. In many respects, the Brexit debate has become proxy for such divisions. It's provided a political narrative for social economic tensions and allowed people to express their anger and frustration. Yes, there's a rise in hate crime, racist attacks, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. It's all absolutely horrific. But does it reflect a more divided society or a small section of society, an abhorrent section of society, you may say, that now feels it is acceptable to express hatred and engage in violence? In other words, that they have been legitimised. And we can blame both politicians on the left and right for that. I think it's also important to look for data and for statistics. I did a quick trawl, but not extensively. But apart from the rise in isolated incidents, and there are instances, there's no significant evidence that community relations, talking about relations between communities, have actually got worse.
So I want to begin by acknowledging that for some the impact of Brexit has undeniably been negative. So even in our own research, we have heard of Eastern European shopkeepers having their businesses vandalised, BME participants feeling stigmatised because of the result. And I really think we have to say that that mustn't be downplayed. However, assessing the lasting trends that underlie those incidents is difficult. So for a start, while numbers of hate crimes reported to the police have risen steadily over the last few years and had peaks around notable events, including the referendum, actually, the crime survey, which is a randomly selected and representative sample of 50,000 households, suggests that numbers of people identifying as victims of hate crime have actually gone down in the same period. So there seems to be some conflicting evidence there. So one of the questions we ask, which is relevant to this discussion, is your area moving closer together or further apart? Now, of the answers we've so far analysed, just over half of participants actually answered neither. And of the remaining participants, about half answered closer together and the other half further apart. Far more often, participants raise specific and systemic factors as the main issues impacting their local areas. So that's the sense of being left behind, cultural and language barriers between groups, youth violence, economic deprivation, inequality. It seems that our actual local experiences are still primarily shaped by forces that predate 2016. And this means that more than ever, our view of community is filtered through external and ideological lenses. As one participant reflected, social cohesion is about being honest about the world. That it isn't just my own little bubble and my own interpretation. It's about providing spaces, helping communities be places where difference doesn't have to be a barrier to flourishing. And this is where the Theos research, I think, comes in, because I think churches actually do offer quite a good model of doing this. It's a sort of form of community building which is encouraging exactly what that participant was talking about. And we can learn from it regardless of our religious background. The ways that churches engage with community, I think, is really critical. So on the one hand, our church-based participants have commonly spoken of a deep care for the community. So there is that genuine local concern. But at the same time, that is framed by a wider vision which draws from and celebrates forms of identity which reach beyond the local. And I think the critical thing that we can learn from here is that there is a creative tension going on between the local and the universal. Finding models that allow us to do that in the way that the church is doing that enable us to opt out of the divisive choices of local, global, national, and try and encompass all of the ways in which humans create community at any one time, whilst not losing sight of the grounded and rooted congregation. Our communities, I don't think, are falling apart, but our conceptual communities are certainly colliding. And these models of relationship building have increasingly been pushed to the fore in our public life. This has been highly divisive, and we need to seek to bring or restore some kind of balance in this situation. And I think that local church engagement provides one such model by which we can do that. And we can think about how else we might do that, not in a church context, obviously.
Actually, what the EU referendum did was to show how much the country was divided. And this picks up on some things that the other two speakers have mentioned so far. Divisions of various kinds, of which attitudes to the EU were only quite a small element for many people. But there are real divides in British society, and the EU referendum has in fact highlighted that those divides are there. For example, between cities and rural areas and small towns. It's often been mentioned of a north-south divide, but it's not as clear as that. Manchester, Sheffield, Liverpool, all voted Remain. And of course, so did Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's by no means necessarily a geographical division. The referendum did highlight what Adam spoke of, really, the sense of focusing on the other, the us and them, and then to a certain extent demonizing the other, so that anyone who is not completely like yourself then becomes, if not exactly a target, though that is the case in the worst examples, nonetheless something that you compare yourself against, and therefore you can vent your frustrations on the other person. There are real tensions in our society at the moment, not just between Remainers and Leavers, but between different groups, some of whom are lining up behind one camp or the other. I do believe there is one principle or observation that could be usefully worked in the sorts of work that many of you in this room are involved in. We talk about identity so much in our society, all the more so because we are now such a varied multicultural society, not least here in London. But we can all have many layers of identity and be perfectly happy with having many layers of identity. And therefore, instead of seeing people superficially by what might be the first, most outward sign of identity, whether it's ethnicity or religious or whatever, perhaps the way forward is to really work on this whole idea of layers of identity and being able to react to people in a much more profound way by acknowledging those different layers rather than focusing on the first and apparently obvious difference. Because the more you look at people's different layers, the more we have in common.